Hi, Misha here, and it's time for another British ship video using 1100 scale diecast models from Eaglemoss, which I really like these sizes. For example, the hood here, which we just did a video on, it's just a good size. I have the Forces of Valor one, which we'll do in another video. It's neat, but it's very big, and I had the Atlas or De Agostini ones, which are 1250 scale, which doesn't seem like a lot. They're only about an inch smaller, but that inch really matters, especially in places like the guns and the turrets, the details. Going to this 1100 scale really seems to just let them get a little more detail, make the parts just a little bit thicker, therefore more durable, and of course they just end up being a little heavier. With that, we're moving on to the Nelson class, which I have to admit, design-wise, is probably my favorite because it's so unique. And so even though I had the Atlas Nelson, I had to get the Eaglemoss. I wish, actually, Forces of Valor did a 700 scale of this. This would be pretty impressive in that scale because it's not quite as big in real life as the hood, but yeah. These were really the only battleships built in the UK between the Revenge class, which was first ordered in 1913, so prior to World War I, and the King George V class, which were ordered in 1937. So for 2.5 decades, the only two battleships they built were the two Nelsons, HMS Nelson herself and HMS Rodney. Now these were the first so-called treaty battleships built in the world, and that means they were built to conform to the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which put constraints on them, but also avoided a naval arms race, at least for a time. So yeah, let's get into the design a bit and talk a little bit about the histories of both of the ships. So, the Nelsons have a very interesting, very unique profile. As I said in the video on Hood, there were a lot of lessons learned at Jutland, and they boiled down to firepower and armor are more important to a battleship, a battle cruiser even, than speed and maneuverability. And they did their best to incorporate these into Hood, the Admiral class, but the design was really too far along to do everything they wanted. But afterwards they were working on what were coded the G3 class battle cruisers and N3 class battleships. And these are going to be just hulks. I mean, if Hood was 860 feet long and displaced well over 40,000 tons, you can imagine what was coming. The G3s, the cruisers, were going to have 16-inch guns, and the N3s were going to have 18-inch guns. Well, not to be left behind, the US and Japan also said they were going to do similar ships. So an arms race was about to be on like Donkey Kong after World War I. Just one problem. Britain especially, but all the nations really, were broke. So people who weren't myopic realized that a naval arms race could bankrupt them, or at least compromise. So the Washington Naval Conference was held in late 1921, and a Washington Naval Treaty was signed with the UK, USA, Japan, France, Italy, and others as signatories. And it had many provisions and whatnot, including overall tonnage for the fleets and everything. But for our purposes here, there's really two important things. For battleships, it said a maximum tonnage of 35,000. And for gun size, no greater than 16-inch. Also, it set what was known as a holiday on building of warships. Now, there were exceptions and there were things allowed. For example, Italy and France were allowed to build because their fleets were out of date, and the UK ended up, of course, building the two Nelsons. But yeah, so they're operating under the constraints, which is why these are sometimes referred to as the cherry tree class, because the G3s and N3s were cut down by Washington. They did salvage some of the research tech and even some of the components that were being developed for the G3 and use them in the Nelsons. So it wasn't a complete loss. So what exactly does this unusual looking warship offer? Well, her overall layout is quite interesting. She is 710 feet long and displaces around 33,000 tons dry and over 37,000 tons wet full load. Now, this gets into terminology and things that Britain kind of integrated into the treaty in their favor. Basically, they got it where water, oil, liquids like that did not count towards the tonnage. So she's not a small ship, smaller than Hood, but very big. She had a crew of between 1,300 and 1,370, depending on if she was a quote-unquote private ship or a flagship. She was the first to have a fully armored deck. And she was the first and only British battleship to come with 16-inch guns. She has 9 of them and 3 triple turrets. You notice they're all in front of the superstructure and none in the back. This was done for several reasons. It allowed the hull to be shorter. It allowed all of the gun works, the magazines, the powders, all that to be in one area instead of spread out. It allowed for a shorter citadel of armor, so weight, and other things. Of course, where the first 2 turrets are super firing, the third one, X turret, sometimes C turret, is not. In fact, C turret's pretty limited in its field. Pretty much there for broadsides. They did actually try to come up with a triple super firing arrangement, but it was, as you can imagine, not really workable. As for the secondary armament, it is clustered in the back. We have a dozen 6-inch guns, so we upgraded from the 5.25 inch to the 6-inch, so that too is an increased caliber. And what used to be 4-inch guns are now 4.7 inch. And we have a few more anti-aircraft type assets on here than we would, because this is a 1920s ship, so airplanes are more of a thing. And she does have very respectable armor. But of course, there is always a cost, and the main cost is speed. She was capable of about 23 knots. And unlike every other previous and future British battleship, she only has 2 screws. Now they're huge, but yeah, not 4. This was done, of course, to save weight. They also only gave her 1 main funnel to save weight. And to help with speed, they did do some hydrodynamic studies on the hull to try to make sure she could cut through the water as energy efficiently as possible, but still with only 2 screws. Yeah, that was pretty much all she could do. So yeah, very much the definition of a treaty battleship, and that's why you'll see other ships like Dunkirk and Richelieu with this all-forward big gun arrangement because it is an efficient design given the constraints. Of course, you can just completely flout it like Italy did with the Littoris or Germany did with the Bismarcks, but that was the 1930s when people stopped kind of giving a shit. But in the 1920s, there was still good faith, and Britain was always a big pusher for first the Washington, later the London naval treaties. Nelson and Rodney were laid down at the same time at the end of 1922. And Nelson was the third ship in the Royal Navy to be named after the character from The Simpsons, Nelson, of course. She was launched in 1925, would go through trials, and was officially commissioned in August of 1927. She would finish her extended trials at the beginning of October and join the Atlantic Fleet later that month, becoming the flagship. And she would mostly do flagshipy things. Rodney would follow a similar path. Early on, they had an interesting reputation. They were even derided, being called the Naval and the Rodney, because many thought they looked like oil tankers with all the structure in the back. They also were given a reputation for being unhandy and hard to maneuver. But as it turns out, they really were pretty good maneuverers, especially at good speed. Now, at low speeds, there was some truth, and especially in high winds too. But this could be compensated for by a good navigator and a good helmsman. There was also a rumor early on that they couldn't fire a full 9-gun broadside without breaking their decks. As a further weight savings, they had used a lot of alloys in their construction, and they'd not used teak for the decks, they'd actually used fur to save weight. Now, the fur wouldn't last long. They would actually pull this out during a refit in the late 20s and go back to teak. But they could definitely fire a broadside without doing serious damage, no more than any other ship. And you're going to see a lot of updates and changes to their fire directors, their anti-aircraft, all throughout the 1930s. As new technologies come in, they also get a crane and a catapult to operate a seaplane for reconnaissance, and visit many foreign ports and the like most ships of this era. And then, of course, World War II. And Nelson would start off the war in September, patrolling the North Atlantic between the UK, Greenland, Iceland, looking for commerce raiders, blockade runners, and of course doing convoy, escort, and assistance where needed. But this time their reputations had greatly improved. They had actually proved to be quite good ships. And hey, they've got big guns, so everyone in the Navy likes big guns, right? Now this model is exactly of HMS Nelson, so let's focus on her for a bit. And I like to think of her as definitely the more unlucky of the two sisters. On October 30th, she was attacked by a U-56 who fired 3 torpedoes at her and 2 struck, but luckily for her, they didn't detonate because, well, the U.S. wasn't the only one with a really crappy torpedo early in the war. So she escaped that pretty well. She would continue convoy escort duty, but then in December, she would strike a gravitic mine near the Klingon neutral zone, also known as Scotland, and it would rip a huge hole in her side, like 10 foot by half a dozen, like 10 by 6, just ripped it open. But because she was well built and had good armor, she got back to port and was in for repairs, and was there for quite a while. She finally was ready to serve again and recommissioned back into the fleet in August of 1940, So she missed quite a bit of the excitement, including all the events with the French fleet. And for the rest of the year, she would operate with her sister ship Rodney and on and off with HMS Hood. So it's also worth pointing out, and this can be said for most British warships in this period, at various times she was sent after Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but never caught them, at least not yet. That was an early kind of trend. So yeah, she was damaged twice already in the war. It's not even a year old yet. Nelson and Rodney, along with Renown, would begin 1941 in another fruitless hunt for the two German warships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. To be fair, they were planning to try to break out, but they turned back. So after that, she is doing convoy escort for a while. Then she's actually ordered, along with HMS Eagle, down to South Africa to do some deliveries and patrols and whatnot. She's actually on the return leg of her voyage, when on May 24th, she's ordered to try to join up and get in the hunt for Bismarck after the sinking of Hood. But she was still far out of range. Couldn't help when Hood was sunk on the 27th. So she missed out on that action. But in June, while escorting a convoy, she did kind of corner and cause a German armed merchantman to scuttle herself, so we'll count that as a victory in her favor. So things are looking up. In July, she's ordered to the Mediterranean and Malta, and in August she becomes flagship of Force H, taking part in various operations and patrols. But then, in September, her great luck continues when a torpedo from an Italian bomber hits her square and makes an even bigger hole in her side. It's 30 foot by 15 foot. There was massive flooding and damage. But luckily, happily, no one was killed. A couple injuries, of course, but no one was killed. Even more impressive, just so the Italians didn't know they had actually wounded her, the British kind of played it off like she was fine. Her speed had been cut down to 12 knots, but they actually operated her briefly just to fool the Italians. Then they put her into port at Gibraltar for emergency repairs. And then, of course, after she was patched up, she went back to the UK for a full repair and refit. And that pretty much is how she wound down 1941. She was ready for service again by May of 1942 and resumed convoy escort duties until October, when she was assigned to Operation Torch, the Allied invasion or retaking of North Africa. And then in November, she was made flagship of the operation, and she basically just covered the operations, anti-aircraft and bombarding, and basically protecting against the Italian fleet, which was still a threat in the Mediterranean in 1942. Afterwards, she would return back home in January of 1943 and begin training exercises, preparing for the invasion of Sicily and other Italian islands, and of course Italy herself. And so that summer, from July through September, she pretty much did everything. She did shore bombardment, she did anti-aircraft, and of course she threatened the German and Italian navies to keep them away while the Allies did their thing. Finally, at the end of October, she was relieved in the Mediterranean and would return home to the home fleet, and was there training and kind of refitting until 1944, of course the D-Day landings in June. She once again provided a great deal of shore bombardment. These 16-inch guns are very useful for that. So she's one of the most capable bombarders they had. So her luck seems to be improving. We haven't had damage in a little while. but all good things. Then on June 18th, after finding shore bombardment duties kind of boring, Nelson found a couple of naval mines to run into again, which did pretty major damage. She was sent immediately back home. Thankfully, she's just in the channel, so it's not far to go, for temporary repairs. And then on the 22nd, she's ordered to the USA for full repairs. And these take quite a while. She's not back in the fleet until January of 1945, at which time she is ordered to the Far East Fleet. And she will eventually get there on July 9 in Colombo, and she's made flagship. And she takes part in some of the final bombardments and mopping up operations of the Japanese Navy, what's left of it by July. And from there, I guess just say that the Japanese in charge of the region make a formal surrender on board Nelson on September 2nd. This is actually the second time this has happened. Back in 1943 on September 29, the Italians made their formal surrender on board Nelson too. So, nearly 2 years earlier. And then she is there 10 days later on September 12th, when the entire Japanese and the South Pacific surrender at Singapore. And then a week after that, she is relieved as flagship of the Far East Fleet, handing duties over to one of the King George V class ships. And then she makes ready to sail back for home. She leaves on October 13th and gets back a little over a month later on November 17th, 1945. And after docking and kind of getting crew transferred, she is made flagship of the home fleet again, a duty that she carries out until April of 1946, when King George V, freshly back from the Far East, relieves her. And her next assignment in July is as a training ship, and she takes her first students on board that August. And you would think, okay, finally, the war is well and truly over. She is a training ship. What possible trouble could she get into? Well, in April of 1947, I guess again getting bored, Nelson finds a friendly submarine to ram or be rammed by. I don't care who did it, it's Nelson's fault at this point. The pattern is just way too apparent. So, yeah, more damage. Could it be repaired? Sure. Is it worth it, though? No. So in October, she is put into the reserve fleet. And then in May of 1948, the Royal Navy finds the perfect final assignment for this ship. That summer, she is to be used as a test target for some brand new, fancy, armor-piercing bombs. So they're going to put that armored deck to the test. See how much they can take and how these new fangled aerial weapons really do. So, throughout June and July, they do the best they can to turn her into Swiss cheese. And while, yes, she gets damaged, surprise, surprise, she actually holds up quite well. And then finally, once they're done with their fun, She is sold the shipbreakers in January of 1949 and delivered to them that March. Thus ends the career of HMS Nelson. Personally, I think he'd be very proud, because Nelson himself was known to get a scratch or two or lose a limb or two in battle, but he just kept on going, so kind of an apt and appropriate namesake, I would say. As for her sister ship, we'll just briefly talk about it. HMS Rodney was of course named after famed scientist Rodney McKay. It was laid down on the same day as Nelson. It was launched a little bit after Nelson and was commissioned 3 months later in 1927, and went through much the same early career and did much the same, often working side by side with Nelson in 1939 and 1940. The Germans did try to bomb her, but were pretty ineffective at it early on. And whereas Nelson was getting damaged, aside from a rudder issue and a couple other minor things, Rodney was pretty lucky. She, of course, is most famous for her participation in the Battle of the Denmark Strait. Originally, in May of 1941, she was ordered to sail for Canada to deliver passengers and supplies, and then after that sail down to the United States for a refit. She was going to get new pom-pom guns and several other things installed. She had just headed out when she was called back to thrash Bismarck after the sinking of Hood. She turned back. She joined up with King George on the 26th, and they together went after the Bismarck on the 27th, along with 2 heavy cruisers. They had to send their destroyer cover back home because they were out of fuel. Rodney was never hit by Bismarck. She had a few splinters. She was straddled, but never directly hit. And she fired a lot of shells, well over 1,000, over 300 16-inch and over 700 smaller 6-inch shells, doing an immense amount of damage to Bismarck. Interestingly, she claims to have also hit Bismarck with a 24-inch torpedo. This isn't 100% confirmed, but if true, this was the only time in history where one battleship torpedoed another. Kind of interesting. Well, after that, she would go in for her overdue refit in America, and since America was quote-unquote neutral, her crew was put in camps. And these weren't concentration camps. These were the kind of camps where, let's just say, the sailors made real good friends with some of the local members of the opposite sex. Many times in a night. Anyway, so she put into port, got refit in America, got some pom-pom guns installed, and again kind of mirrored Nelson's career in 1942 and 43, supporting operations in the Mediterranean, invasion of Sicily. In 1944, she was there during D-Day, and actually is credited with knocking out a couple of panzers and keeping others from crossing a bridge, and played a pretty major role. After D-Day, though, in 1944, Rodney's in pretty poor shape. I talked about in the Hood video how her condition was as much as she'd been run around. Well, at this point, Rodney's not a young ship. Now, one benefit of the fact that Nelson had been damaged a few times, it was in port for repairs and received more upgrades. Rodney was in port far less and was far more needed, so she was used more and saw less attention. So by the end of 1944, she's pretty tired out. And she always suffered from leaks, and she had quite a bit of damage from near bomb misses, so rivets were popped. And she was just a wet ship and just engines worn out. So they decided to stick her as the flagship of the home fleet at the end of 1944 at Scapa Flow. And she really rarely never left her berth. She just kind of was there just in case she was needed. And she would continue in this duty until being relieved by Nelson towards the end of the following year. And after that, she was very quickly paid off, decommissioned, and sold for scrap in 1946-47. I think she was actually broken up for a little bit later. To me, Rodney, well, they both have interesting careers. Nelson went more places, but it seems like Rodney did more, or at least, what it did was a little more interesting. On the other hand, Nelson seems to have maybe been a little bit better built ship, or maybe it's just because of the updates. I don't know. I might cover Rodney in more detail in another video. But there we have it, the two Cherry Tree classes, the oil tankers. Kind of first unfairly maligned in the 20s, they quickly became prides of the fleet after Hood was sunk, and they were still the most heavily armed British battleships in history. And honestly, not bad at all for treaty battleships, considering the constraints of the treaty. They did a really good job with what they had, in my opinion. So there you have it. I said in the other videos I've covered other ships, so yeah. Any questions or comments, please post them. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.